countries. My name is Carl Friedhoff. I'm a fellow here in public opinion and foreign policy, and I'm going to be moderating the event today with our panel. So on behalf of the council, again, let me welcome everyone as we get ready to kick off this discussion. For nearly a century, the Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different perspectives to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We try to bring leading global voices, such as some of them that we have here today, to discuss some of the world's most important issues. I will stress that the views you hear today are not the views of the council, they are the views of the speakers themselves. A few housekeeping notes. First, that we are on the record and we are being live streamed. That's a reminder both to the audience and to our panelists. And the report that we will be discussing will be available on our website. I think everyone should have a copy of the report in front of them. And this report is the product of cooperation between the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and Dataway Horizon. Victor Yuan, immediately to my left, is the chairman of Dataway Horizon, and this is the second year that we've cooperated. He runs one of the leading polling firms in China, and he not only does polling, but as I've been learning slowly over the past few days, he has a variety of interests and does a variety of things in China, including 7 million followers on Weibo, some of which were following along as he and I attended the Chicago Bulls game last night. So yes, we've worked with Victor in several ways, and while this is the initial report, we also have a later report coming out focusing on Asia more broadly, where it won't just be the US-China results, it's going to be US, China, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and Australia. So this is a snapshot of the data, but for a more comparative look, we'll be releasing something much fuller in January. It's important to note that Victor's joining us here. He has come from China to take part in what we call our Scholl Fellowship. And so it's the Dr. Scholl Foundation Visiting Fellow on U.S.-China Relations is the official title. He'll be with us for nearly 2 weeks, and next Wednesday evening he'll give the annual Dr. Scholl lecture. So if you would like to see more of him, you can do it then. Our other speakers today, sitting in the middle, is Damien Ma. Damien is the Associate Director of the think tank at the Paulson Institute down in Hyde Park. He's a widely published expert on China, including his most recent book, In Line Behind a Billion People. Prior to his time with the Paulson Institute, he was the lead analyst at the Eurasia Group for Mongolia and China. And finally, we have my colleague sitting at the end, Craig Kafura. He's a research associate here at the Council on Global Affairs, and he has worked extensively on our public opinion work. He's also a Pacific Forum CSIS Young Leader. So the report that we're going to be discussing today, unfortunately, I don't think that there are any real clear takeaways from it. What we see is that the Chinese public and the American public both view the role of their respective countries to be relatively the same. They want their country to be active in world affairs. They both prefer shared leadership, although it's not quite clear what shared leadership would mean in either country, as that wasn't specifically asked in the question. But the other thing that comes out of this is that there is quite a bit of mistrust between the countries. That comes through in the data as well. I don't want to preempt any of our speakers, so I'm going to ask each of our speakers to go for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then at the end of that, I'll have a round of moderated questions, and then for perhaps the last 15 to 20 minutes, we'll open it up to the audience so you can ask questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Victor to speak first on perceptions of Chinese public opinion within the report.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Actually, we started to do the similar topic study we call the World in Chinese Eyes. We started from 1995. So far it's around like 20 years. We do similar things. We follow how Chinese look at the different countries, especially the country like United States. So we have the comparative data, and this time it's our honor to work together with the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, and I try to have that kind of a comparative perspective to understand it better from both sides. And we have the data report, so that's why the colleagues from the council is doing very carefully to try to have the parallel data and see how Chinese view the situation, view the question, the result, and how the American look at the same questions. So we have a very clear the result to show how the people from the two countries look at each other. So I'm trying to just take the limited time to share, to highlight some point to see how Chinese look at the relationship between the two countries, and especially to help to understand why is that. The first point I would say, both Chinese and American would see that their country can take part in a very active role in the world. It's basically 64% of American and 66 Chinese say that they will see their country become more active. So that's why from China side, the general public was a very high support to the government. For them, they're doing more in the peacekeeping, the trip in the UN, and also would like to very actively involve in the country like Afghanistan and the South Sudan and some other places. It's this from the politically, but also see from the economically, like One Belt One Road is also got a pretty high, very active reaction from the business community and also from the general public opinion. And at the same time, there could be, because originally Americanness was kind of a worldwide role, but China is kind of a regional role, it's a rising role. So it could be, has a kind of crash because they will come together. For both sides want to be take an active role, active part. It could be kind of a conflict there. Then when we check about the ideas from the both sides, then we can see there's also clearly the public opinion polling, public opinion from the American side say they would like to see 63% of people that will see there could be the two countries could undertake a friendly cooperation and engagement in the world affairs. 58 Chinese hold the same idea at some point. And we also have some other report and the data I bring from some other sources that shows then we can see the Chinese believe that even how to keep a peaceful regional order and could be participated with by the both countries from U.S. and China. They work together will keep regional the peace in Asia area, Pacific Asia area. So in that sense, with a strong public support to let the two countries will come together to figure out the way to work together, share the leadership of the change in the world order. The sharing leadership idea was about 50% of support from Chinese public, and compared to the dominated. If China would like to dominate the world leadership in the near future, that's only 37% support. So that's the first. Both wanted the active role in the world, but both the majority of the public opinion will support the shared leadership. The second point is that the Chinese public was a quite a high respect the U.S. and also American people. And also they believe the China and the Chinese deserve the U.S. respect. I think there are some interesting things here that we have a bunch of data to show that the Chinese believe the political system, the culture, innovative culture, the education, the technology development, and all this stuff in the United States, of course, including many commercial brands. Those things, Americans doing very well. If we look at the role model in the world, or in all this aspect, was regarded as a top. That's a top of when those people look at the United States. And economically, United States were ranking as a top one important country when the Chinese look at the list of all other countries. And also, when I look at the military power, U.S. is much stronger than China, and also that's top one in the world. When the people will say, see, who are the most influential country in the world? When Chinese to see American and say to China, they give the same score, which means almost the same influential country in the world. So that means mostly the typical Chinese, or ordinary Chinese, they really believe in American is a great country, and in many aspects, except for somewhere in the how they deal with world affairs. So especially when they look at the situation in the about rebalance policy to Asia Pacific, 68% of Chinese say they don't see that as a good way, and because basically when the ordinary Chinese look at the disputes, including the territorial disputes around China, why is it so terrified? That's because they believe the black hand from the United States behind that. And 67% of Chinese say America not show proper respect to China. But for the most of Chinese, they believe the progress of the performance China had so far deserve respect that. And for this, this time we do the polling, and when they see if their parents' life is worse off or better off, they believe their parents is worse off. So that means the current life is better off compared to their parents. And in the future, 63% of Chinese believe that the future life for their kids will better off compared to their current life. Well, compared to the number from the United States, which is much higher, which means people quite satisfied with the achievement and the performance of a changing of their life quality. Of course, there are a bunch of the problem that we still face with in China. So far we are doing public opinion polling about what kind of social concern what Chinese people face with. Every year we have a ranking list. And this year's, the top one is food safety. The second one is air quality. The third one is social security, especially for aging population, the situation. We do have those kind of problem and people face with. And maybe people from the United States, American side, not understand which is a big problem for rural Chinese people. The number one is now we don't need to pay agricultural tax, and also life is better. But problem is that we cannot find time for entertainment. The second problem is there are too many garbage everywhere. So that's compared to the situation before, it's quite different issues and problem. But even though the majority of Chinese still believe the country itself on the right track, the most recent polling from the Ipsos says that 89% of Chinese believe the country is on the right track. The data from our side is like 78% of Chinese believe the country on the right track. The data from the United States side is 32 to 34%. So it means basically the general direction, if you quite identify the big direction of the country's development, although we made so many the questions and very specific problems. The third point is about the security. The security relationship really matters. Although we see so many the positive factors, and Chinese people really appreciate American culture and the country. But still, I think the problem from the relationship about the security part is make a kind of negative effect there. Actually, the country people like the most And also they believe the most offended country is Russia to China. And the country next to Russia is a country like before the June and July, that's South Korea, and then Canada, and also the countries like the Germany and France. Interestingly, the South Korea is an interesting case that before the SARS issue, South Korea was regarded one of the countries most friendly and reliable country. But after SARS the issues was appeared, the Korea became one of the most unreliable country. Actually, 37% of people believe they are unreliable. That's between before the SARS. But after that, 61% believe the South Korea is unreliable. And before that, 70% of Chinese people believe South Korea can deal with the water issue properly and responsibly. But after that, it's only around 50%. So we can see the security issue is a very sensitive issue with impact people's attitude about if the country is very friendly to China. Actually, 68% of Chinese people, 68%, as I already said, they're against the new rebalance policy. And also 58% they believe that U.S. should reduce its military existence in Asia area. But even we see this situation because usually if we not consider security, the relationship, usually Chinese people will feel very warm about United States, and especially when they say, if we mention any country, you emotionally feel warm, which the country, and actually the score from China side, give to China and give to US is almost the same. It's a 10 degree, it's all 7.9, which is basically, if you not consider about security issues, that's a pretty positive feeling to this country. Interesting, there's an internet saying about how Chinese look at the country like the US and the Japanese. And the saying is that no matter how bad the relationship between China and the US, the relationship could be warm up in the overnight. No matter how good between the China and the Japan, the relationship could be worse and it could be bad overnight. So which means the majority of the factors between these two countries is a cheer, the feeling, as if from China side, the Chinese side is a cheer that they are feeling to the country up. They mostly are very positive. So that's why I think the security side, no matter the new administration, what kind of measures they will take, but could possibly still need a kind of a contact and figure out the way how to work together to do more positive things in that side.
All right, thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
Next, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Craig Kafura to discuss the report and perhaps take a more American perspective on the data. Craig?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for sharing all that, Victor. I've taken a lot of notes, and now I have a lot more questions for you afterwards. So I'm also going to try to frame this in kind of 4 general areas, starting with American views of the relationship overall, American views of Chinese power and influence, American views of China as a threat, and then American views on US-China policy. And as Carl said at the beginning, it would be really nice if there was a very simple and clean takeaway message from all of this data. Unfortunately, it's a bit mixed, and there's going to be a bunch of shades of nuance that I'm going to have to try to draw out. So first, the relationship. American views on China have been fairly stable over the last nearly 40 years that the Council has done polling on views of the US-China relationship. We ask a question called a feeling thermometer, asking Americans to rate various countries on a scale from 0 to 100. China in 1978 rated 44 degrees. In 2016, it rated 44 degrees. Now, there have been a bit of ups and downs in the last 38 years, but we are back essentially where we started in 78. At the same time, when we ask about the track of the relationship, whether it's getting better or worse or staying about the same, Americans are more pessimistic than their allies around the region. 46% say the relationship's staying about the same, and 40% say it's worsening. Only 11% say it's improving. In previous surveys, we've asked about whether Americans see the US and China as rivals or partners, and they've been very divided on this. Every year that we've asked it over the last decade, they're very closely divided. I think in 2014 it was 49% partners and 48% rivals. In 2015, we also asked whether China was a reliable partner for the US, and they were divided on that also. 46% said that China was very or somewhat reliable, and 52% said not very or not at all reliable. Now, I think those are largely based on economic ties, because we asked a follow-up question asking, why do you say that China is not a reliable partner, or why do you say that it is? Most people who said that China is reliable cited strong economic ties between the two countries, and views about it not being a reliable partner tended to focus on differences between the political system or perceptions of China as being a self-interested power and not interested in cooperation. But Americans also clearly see it as important. 55% said it was very important, making it the most important relationship Americans identified in the Asia-Pacific, more than US-Japan, US-Korea, or US-India relations. And they also care about it because it is also the second most powerful country in the world in Americans' eyes. Americans always rate the US as the most influential country. Americans are very full of themselves sometimes. But Americans rate China just below the US. They rate the US at an 8.5 on the 10-point scale that Victor talked about, and they rate China at 7.1. That's above the European Union that comes in at a 7, above Russia at 6.2, and above other countries in the region. And Americans also see China's influence as growing in the region. In 2015, we asked if different countries' influence in the region would increase or decrease over the next 10 years. 52% of Americans said that China's regional influence would increase. The only country where a majority of Americans said that their influence was on the rise. But, and again, this is where we get back to the on the one hand and on the other hand. On the other hand, 56% said that China was playing a negative role in resolving key problems in the region. So we have a country that is clearly very important to Americans. They're divided on whether or not we're partners or rivals. We're divided on whether or not they're a reliable partner or not. But we clearly think they're important, and we clearly think they're powerful. So let's talk about the sources of some of that power. If you ask Americans about the major sources for a country's influence, 71% say economic power is more important than military power. But Americans are not particularly confident in their own economic power vis-a-vis China. 38% of Americans say that China is a stronger economic power than the US. 31% of Americans say that the US is the stronger power, and 28% say that they're about equal. They're only more confident when it comes to the military, which they themselves don't see as the more important role for influence. 50% of Americans say the US is the stronger military. Only 15% say China is stronger, and then 32% say they're about equal. So this is clearly somewhat of a mixed bag. So let's talk about, do Americans see China as a threat? Well, no, not really. We've asked about the development of China as a world power being a critical threat to the US for decades, starting back in 1994. And it never really got that high. It got up into the mid-50s during the late 1990s and then dropped off starting in 2004. The last time we asked it was in 2014. Only 41% saw the development of China as a world power as a critical threat. This year we asked about specifically China's military power and economic power. And those came in even lower. 38% of Americans said China's military power was a threat. Only 30% saw China's economic power as a threat. This is much lower than most of the other things that come out in this battery. It's below climate change, it's below immigration, it's much below issues like the spread of nuclear weapons or international terrorism or Islamic extremist groups like ISIS. It's not making the top set of threats for Americans. But, and we're back to the other hand, there's some mixed signals on what the growth of China means for the US. In 2014, 41% of Americans said that if China's economy were to grow as large as the US economy, which is projected to happen, I think, in 2026, 41% said that would be mostly negative. 47% said it would be equally positive and negative. Only 10% said that would be mostly positive. So while they don't see it as a threat, they're also not entirely sure how to feel about the future size of the Chinese economy. So given all of that, given the importance, the mixed perceptions, what do they want to do in US-China policy? Well, the first thing is they're not particularly hawkish on China. If we ask them whether they would rather engage in friendly cooperation and engagement over actively working to limit the growth of China, 63% say they want friendly cooperation and engagement, 33% say limiting China's growth. And that's been very consistent. We've asked this for about a decade, and we always get roughly the same result. But, back to the other hand, 62% of Americans say that if we have to choose between our traditional allies in the region, like South Korea and Japan, over a new partnership with China, 62% pick the traditional allies. 28% say a new partnership with China. And there's concerns among Americans that China is not reciprocating what they see as Americans' friendly cooperation and engagement. 66% of Americans say that China is working to limit US power and influence. Only 27% say that China is actively seeking to cooperate with the US. So this is a very mixed bag. And that's why it's a little hard for us to draw like a single clear conclusion. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to conclude this report. In a lot of ways, I think, hearing Victor's take on the China data, the US and China are very similar in a lot of ways. They see themselves as influential countries. They both want to play active roles in the world, but they differ on how they view other countries in the region. And Americans, I think, are much less secure about their future economic growth and about the status of their economy vis-a-vis China. Damien, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about the policy implications of all this.
All right, thanks, Craig. Yeah, as Craig noted, our last speaker is Damien, and I've given him perhaps the most difficult task of the morning. While Victor and Craig are able to kind of talk about something quantifiable in terms of data, something that you can kind of really understand, you can see, you can perhaps in some ways get your hands around, I've asked Damien to talk about future US policy in Asia, which at this point, no one quite knows what that means. So I'm sure Damien will explain more, but I expect that it will come with a very large caveat as he explains how he sees kind of US policy in the region moving forward. Damien?
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Victor. And thank you, Craig, for a very enlightening set of figures and survey data. I think it's not an understatement to say that the US-China relationship is very complicated. There are a lot of contradictions, as apparent in your survey results. But it is, at the same time, it is one of the most mature, I think, major relationships in the world. Ever since normalization under President Carter in 1979 until current President Obama, we've had a very stable relationship. If you think about what that means, it's actually quite remarkable. You have two very major countries have ostensibly different political systems. In many ways differing values, but somehow for 40 years or so, it's been a very basically stable and normal relationship. And obviously there's always been defined by elements of, I guess, what I would call co-opetition, so cooperation and competition. And under any given period, there may be more tilted toward competition or more tilted toward cooperation. But those two elements were always defined this relationship. And I think an important pillar of the relationship, again, for the last 35, 40 years, has been on the economic and trade side. When you think about, before I get to the future of the US policy, it's important to understand where we are today. And the US policy for the past 35 years has really just been one of both engagement and hedging against a potential China threat, if you want to call it that. But the basic strategy has been trying to embed China into the existing prevailing global order, whether it's the WTO, the United Nations. China is deeply in all those global institutions that were led and created by the United States after World War II. So China clearly is a stakeholder in those institutions. Now, does it think the institutions should exist as they are currently? I think China has some concerns about whether all these institutions currently serve its interests. And as China becomes more powerful, economically more influential, that's not a abnormal question to ask. And I think China certainly wants to be at the table, and China may want to actually change the drapes and curtains a little bit. But I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of rhetoric that often gets lost during election campaigns or out of DC. I mean, China is not a revolutionary power. We're not talking about Mao Zedong's China anymore. They're not seeking to overturn the current global order. And in fact, if you look at what President Xi and the current leadership have been saying, they've become probably the biggest defender of globalization. They've become the biggest defender of the WTO and trade in our current time, in part because China has benefited dramatically from WTO and also economic globalization. So, but it is also important to understand that China is, in many ways, not a revolutionary, but a disruptive power. In part because of its size, its weight, its ambitions. You can't have 20% of humanity rise economically, get to 60% of the U.S. GDP, and not be disruptive. That the weight will automatically shift. And I think one of the problems is that the world has been slow to adapt to this shifting of weights, and we're not quite sure what to do with it. And it may be because China has caught up faster than we had anticipated, and so global institutions have been slower to adapt. For example, there's been a lot of talk about China creating some new institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. That got a lot of pushback in D.C. But in fact, that was born out of China's frustration with lack of reforms in the IMF and other institutions that were not doing infrastructure on investing anymore. So again, I don't see that as wanting to overhaul the existing system. It's trying to come up with something that they think is complementary. Now, what does the future hold, though? If the current status quo is sort of this bipartisan consensus on embedding China in the global world order, and making sure that it has bought into it, which I would argue they have for the most part. Obviously, there's some problems in terms of different views on things like North Korea and Iran. But when you're talking about the order and institutions China is definitely in, I think the key risk to me, the key potential challenge going forward is when it comes to U.S.-China specifically, because the relationship has been so predicated on the economic side, on trade, and on sort of bilateral investments, U.S. companies going to China, Chinese companies coming here. That is a very important constituency in both countries to support the continuation of the economic relationship. But there is some evidence that that potential coalition may be fraying a little bit, especially in the United States, in part because of competitive pressures in the Chinese market, in part because of the rise of Chinese state-owned enterprises that are causing a lot of problems for U.S. firms, and that's a well-known fact. And to the extent that this economic coalition becomes more timid or quiet, that makes this relationship harder to manage. Because once the economic pillar becomes softer, so to speak, then what fills that is the national security side for the most part. And we all know there are some fairly intractable problems on the national security side, going from the South China Sea, North Korea, Iran, and so on. So this is a red flag to really pay attention to in my mind. And this is important too because we're entering a new administration under Donald Trump, and his views are all over the place. The caveat is I don't think he really has a clear Asia policy per se. He does not seem to have any. I can't discern an overarching principle or ideology when it comes to Asia policy. So it's very hard to say what he will do until we know who he will pick as his Asia policy personnel. With that caveat out of the way, it does seem like he has some fairly anti-trade tendencies. anti-globalization tendencies, and that's reflected in this current election as well. So that if the economic side becomes even less prominent and declines further, that is going to be problematic for the bilateral relationship. You can talk about the failure of TPP, and you can talk about a number of on issues, but I think there's got to be a way going forward if both sides are interested in a more stabilized status quo relationship. I think we really need to figure out how to bolster and sustain the economic side. And we shouldn't forget that China is undergoing a fairly significant economic transition itself domestically. And that could prove volatile and disruptive for the Chinese domestic economy, and that's something that we don't often think about very much. And just take the currency, for example. Trump has been calling for currency manipulation, but that's a complete misunderstanding of what's actually happening in China right now. China is actually trying to prop up the currency or to stabilize it, to prevent it from dropping further. And it's actually proving to be very challenging for the Chinese central bank to do so because of a lot of capital outflows. So there's this rhetoric that does not quite match the current reality. And we really need to think harder about what we should be doing on the economic side, because I do think there are some pretty significant challenges on that side, and I can't stress enough that if that coalition becomes weaker, so to speak, on either side, this could make this relationship much harder to manage, from everything from climate change to security side, because there will be spillover effects.
Thanks, Damien. Before throwing it open to the floor for Q&A, I'll take moderator's prerogative and ask a round of questions. I'll go in reverse order. So Damien, one of the things we hear a lot in the U.S., I think we hear a lot about U.S. interest in Asia. We hear about the issue that Victor brought up of THAAD, this missile battery that's going to be placed in South Korea to protect kind of U.S. forces from a preemptive attack from North Korea. We hear about freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. TPP is in there on the economic side. But what we often don't hear about is Chinese interests, as I think that is part of what is very little understood throughout the United States. Could you talk about what you think are the biggest misperceptions of what is covered in American media about Chinese interest, and with one thing that everyone in this room should take away to understand Chinese interest a little bit better?
That's a very good question. Let me just give you an example since you brought up Korea. Let's talk about the Korean Peninsula a little bit. I think it's not so much that there's a misalignment of interests. I think when you ask, is China interested in a denuclearized Korean Peninsula, they will say absolutely. That aligns with our interest of a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. But it's about the priority of interests. Their paramount interest is stability on the Korean Peninsula. And so that takes precedence over denuclearization. Sure, they would love to see a denuclearized Korean Peninsula, but if that comes at the cost of a destabilized North Korea, that's a non-starter for Beijing. So I think it's going even more micro to thinking less about sort of are we aligned on even things like Iran. Sure, I think there is alignment of interest, but the actions that each would want to take that derives from the interest is different, and the hierarchy is different. And so I think the other point I would like to make right now is that Chinese interest right now has, since the pivot and the rebalance, China has certainly launched their own initiatives kind of westward, obviously the Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road. China has, I think, in many ways realized that there's been some pushback regionally against their recent actions in the maritime space and elsewhere. And I think they've really pushed and doubled down on what I would call kind of talk softer and carry a large purse, checkbook diplomacy. And I think that's been a central piece of the President Xi's foreign policy right now, which is this OPOR initiative, and they're making it very inclusive. And every time they talk about it, it's a very inclusive idea. And so to me, that's going to be again, it's always sort of the economic connectivity that takes primacy on many fronts.
All right. To Craig, one thing that Damien brought up in his comments was about kind of China being now the defender of globalization and the biggest defender of the WTO. And he also talked about kind of the decline of support for globalization in the US, especially as kind of espoused by Donald Trump throughout the campaign. Could you cover kind of American attitudes towards globalization? Because my sense is that, well, I know that from what we saw in the data that there's a misalignment between what was said in the campaign and where the American public is. So could you highlight that a little bit?
Sure. So it's a really good point, and one that we've tried to make a couple times in talking about American attitudes on trade and globalization and the TPP also. A lot of the rhetoric during the campaign was very hostile to globalization broadly, to trade more specifically, and to the TPP very, very specifically. We had all of the major candidates coming out against the TPP during the primaries, but also during the general campaign. And now that even if Clinton had won the election, the odds the TPP would pass were not exactly looking good. But this is not exactly a public opinion problem for trade or globalization or the TPP. Majorities of Americans say that globalization is mostly good, 65%. Majorities of Americans say that international trade is good for the US economy, it's good for their own standard of living, it's good for consumers like them. Where you get negative pushback on international trade is on jobs. Americans don't think that international trade is good for Americans' job security, and they don't think it's good for creating jobs in the US. And that's particularly strong among what we would call core supporters of Donald Trump, people who supported Donald Trump as the top choice for president back in June when there were still multiple candidates. And we also have started to see a bit of a shift on views of globalization among the parties. Traditionally, we think of Republicans as being the strong pro-trade and pro-globalization and pro-business party. But among the public, Democrats have been the ones who have been getting more positive on globalization and trade. Republicans have been staying flat or actually declining in their support for trade and globalization. So there's a bit of a flip going on among the public at home when we talk about these interest groups at home for support for trade and globalization. That's something to keep an eye out for. Obviously, the catch for Democrats is that one of their key interest groups, organized labor, is both getting weaker nationally, but also remains fairly opposed to some of these trade deals.
Thank you. Turning to Victor. One of the things, if you look at a lot of the polling throughout East Asia, these countries who have gone through very kind of rapid industrialization, what you experience is that the older generations have lived very different lives from the younger generations. And so you see things emerge that are very broad differences in public opinion. So for example, as someone who specializes in the Korean Peninsula, if you look at South Korea, the gap between the people in their 60s and the people in their 20s on a range of issues, including North Korea, is huge. So there's these very different attitudes towards how these people, how they're interpreting the world around them. So one thing we didn't cover in the report is these age gaps. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the age gaps that exist within China, from the oldest Chinese to the youngest Chinese, and specifically how they're viewing the relationship with America. Is there a big gap there, and if so, why? What is driving that gap?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question because we really talk a lot when we do the policy study and we do the market research study. We always pay serious attention to the generation gap. If we talk about the other aspect, we do see a big gap between the young generation and older generation. The young generation basically was born in 1980s and after was called the first generation, second and the third generation of single kid generation. They're quite different because simply the age, their parents and above. So basically, when we was born in, mostly was born in a typical rural and city family, and it was at quite a low quality life. But for oldest kids, because they are single kids, it was even you was born in a rural family, and your parents and your grandparents from mother side, father side, six adults, and they give money to the one kid. So kids was as a middle class kids. So that's the big gap is that In China, we have so-called older generation middle class and a young generation middle class. The older generation middle class is different people that are working hard and try to make in their life, but someone will get a pretty success and come to the middle class. But for the young generation, almost every kids are middle class kid in every family, because basically all the adults will serve that kids, so kids was living, better off life. And also that's let them feel that life is good, life the quality is good, and that's their basic life perception. It's not like my age. So in that sense, even though they have a when they look at the world, and even now they grew up, they go to study in the United States or Europe, and this country, they compare to the same age kids. They don't feel that they are like my age. We are, where life is not that high, but so we need to study hard, work hard, and we try to make a better future. They feel that we are living a pretty good life, and of course we study hard, then in the future we want to do something I like. So that's a pretty different way. That's come out a different mindset when they look at the policy, when they look at the public service, when they look at the business service. They raise some different requirements, and also they wanted something better, and they will not have that kind of a so-called vertical comparative perspective, because now life is much better than before. No, they want even better and even better. So they always be critical to anybody. They're critical to parents, they're critical to school, and they're critical to government, and they're critical anything, because they want a better and a better life. So that's the difference. Every time we do the polling and the result about very specific issues, we see the generations. But when we see the attitude to the United States, interestingly, the group with the most favorable attitude is age between 35 to 55. They're most positive. And the older generation is relatively high negative. And the young generation is not as high as the positive, is not as high as the middle age. It's okay, but not that high. The reason is that when we compare so-called nationalistic sentimental, young generation is a little bit high, because they feel that the United States not show enough respect to China. So the feeling is stronger. But at the same time, it's not that low. It's just a slight gap. They still show very high respect to U.S. And they are pretty desire to know more about the United States, because that's highly relevant about it. They want to, if their place they want to choose to study, U.S. is the number one destination. The place you want to do startup, what kind of a model you need? You need to learn and imitate, which is any model from the United States. And actually, for the countries between U.S. and China, which was a very special relation and at a young generation in their eyes compared to all other countries, even compared to like Japan and compared to like Germany, because U.S. is a country that we share the exchange and independence on the traditional economy part, manufacturing, the big brands, P&G, GM. At the same time, also share the new economy. The new economy is a very unique side between the U.S. and the China side. Almost all the startup models will come from the United States. And then all this legend of the people, how to suddenly become so successful, that's from U.S. And you study this model, and also sometimes you get sometimes directly you get U.S. dollar funds, the VC funds that support you to do that. And finally, your final goal is like listed in the NASDAQ stock market and or the New York stock market. That's only the stock market is so open to Chinese, not in the Tokyo stock market, not in the London stock market, not anywhere in the world. Only U.S. is like for young generation. You study here, you can even stay in China. The most of the modern textbook was basically imitate the textbook here. MBA training, MPA training, and psychology training, sociology training. All this textbook was basically comes from US. And every 100 new published book translated from outside, 80 is from US, 10 from Europe, 6 from Korea and Japan, and 4 from the rest of the world. So basically, the American is an intellectual provider. And so we talk about the world pictures given by US. So that's for the young people. They have that kind of desire. If they know more, they got a key to how to be successful. So that's I think is an amazing story between China. That's also sometimes I talk to Japanese friends that, so we don't share the new economy. We don't share the capital, the VC capital for our young people. So for that part, I think for the middle age, for their parents, they respect the US because the US is powerful. And also, someday they want to send the kids to outside to study, there will be a destination. But for young kids, they desire to know more about the United States because that's highly relevant about their future. So to some degree, I think for the young generation, they share kind of a common future and with the US. Because that's from their side, maybe not necessary. It's not the same share with American young people. That's also my question is that, is a young generation from US at the same age is also so desirable, so want to know about what happened in China, or would it be the possibility, figure out a way to work together to, to make up the new economy happen and share more about the common interest in the future. So of course, if you come to the university, and interestingly now the Chinese is the biggest national student group in China. And in China, every 5 graduate from the high school, 1 is go outside. And each 3 students go outside, 1 come to the United States. And also, for the rest, it's not because they don't want to be here. They cannot be here because they haven't been admitted by the university here. Mm-hmm. And actually, 70% of students, if they want to outside, actually, originally they want to the United States. But only 30% of them get successfully come here. So that's, you can see the whole picture. I think, when the young generation, they share more common future. So I think the favorable attitude will be rising more. And so far, I think it's really a good foundation already, because the young generation is goes through the internet or some other ways. They really so interested in information and data and all this successful model here.
There's interesting points there with Damien's kind of concern on the economic side, and with Victor kind of highlighting the ongoing economic kind of base that's there about people coming in and being able to list on the NASDAQ and other places. So I'll open it up to the floor if there are questions. If you have a question, I'll ask you to raise your hand and then follow the 3 good rules of question asking. Number 1, identify yourself. Number 2, please be concise. And number 3, make sure that it ends in a question mark. John? Oh, we have one over here. Yeah, please.
Thank you, speakers. My name is Jingnan Huo. I'm, actually a Chinese student in Northwestern University, Medill School of Journalism. And thank you, speakers, for a very insightful talk. And I actually have 2 questions. So first one is, so I noticed like both of these surveys are both in China and America are conducted before the election of Donald Trump. So how would you think the results would have changed had it been conducted now, like after the election? Would the opinions have changed, and how would they have changed? And the second set of questions is probably more directed towards Dr. Yuan, and other speakers are welcome to comment as well. So to what extent do you think the opinions of the Chinese public has an influence over the Chinese government's foreign policy towards the United States? And also, does it actually have maybe more impact towards China-US businesses than towards the government in terms of public opinion?
Craig, do you want to handle the first question on the potential change in the data after the election?
Sure. This is a question I've gotten a lot in the last couple of weeks, given the shock of the election. My guess is that you might see some small changes on the direction of the relationship when we ask about whether it's improving or worsening. We might also see some changes on perceptions of Americans' own economic fortunes. One of the notable trends that Gallup tracks is whether you're feeling positive or negative about your personal economic situation. And after the election, Republicans suddenly discovered that the economy was doing really well. Obviously, politics plays a big role in how people think about economics, which always makes me skeptical when people blame economic perceptions of bad economic times for voting behavior. But I'm getting a bit off track. My guess is that most of the questions wouldn't be very different. Whenever we ask these questions, we tend to see very stable trends over time, even over very long stretches of time. So for example, I mentioned that our general feelings toward China question, we are now back in the same place as we were in 1978. And think about all of the things that have happened between 1978 and now in US-China relations. And that question hasn't jumped around that much. So these deeper policy questions, they might be affected if there's a major shock in US-China relations, but I don't think the election by itself would have that impact.
Victor, you want to handle number two? And Damien, if you want to jump in as well.
Maybe my guess is not a big change because we haven't seen any clear China policy given by elected president. So if the new president, his policies, as he said during the campaign, I think that's people already know and say that's really happened. So that's still there. But if he will adjust his policy, he will win a much better, positive respect from or feedback from the Chinese general public. So that's one angle. Another angle is that this time, interestingly, the general Chinese public usually they're for Democratic candidate. This time, still slightly high percentage of Chinese people say we will support Hillary Clinton. But Donald Trump is the first Republican candidates. So when a relatively high support compared to all other Republican candidates in the future, in the past. So that's why there are many Chinese believe he's a business person, and he's someone could create something different. So although some unfriendly words to China, but still, as a business person, we can negotiate and we can talk. It's not like Hillary Clinton's deliver very clear, and some policies more close to Obama's already done. So which is Chinese don't like. And then the TPP and rebalance, all this closer security relationship with Japan and Korea, all this stuff is not general Chinese like. So that's why, at least for part of Chinese, there was a more expected to Donald Trump. That's one thing. So your question is about if Chinese general public, their idea was be impacted by government foreign policy? Yes. Because that's one of the main information sources they got and about the policy attitude to U.S., to the neighboring countries, to Japan. That's highly, I think, is highly influential factor. But at the same time, because this issue is always discussed in July in the Japanese, in Japan, we in Tokyo have a Tokyo-Beijing forum. Because interestingly, we check how the people should get the information about the other country. The Japanese, 97% from the traditional media. And the Chinese, it was 7% more from the traditional media, but also as about more than 40% from the internet, the social media. And also pretty high the way it's they're from the book and from the, and it's interesting when they got the information from the video game, internet game about Japan, So it's a more diversified. It's the same from US. When I go to the University of Chicago and the Northwestern University, you see all the Chinese students here. They have a WeChat and they have the Weibo, and they send a message back to China. So people, especially for young people, they want to know the information, not from CCTV news report anymore. Also not from the People's Daily. They're from the social media. So in that sense, Of course, still government ideas was an important impact, but also was impact from the other side. So it's a more multiple source impactor. So I think in that case, people can choose. And also then for the older generation, there's a more rely on the traditional media, and which is more impacted from government. But for young generation, there was a much stronger impactor from the social media. And I remember when I talk about younger, that's about my age. I'm 45 years old, but mostly my information is from the social media. I'm not from the traditional media. I don't have time to watch TV set already. So when I look at this, now it's a much diversified compared to the situation before.
Out of respect for everyone's time, we're now butting up against the deadline, so I'd like to end it here. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and everyone, thank you for coming. With that, we are adjourned.
Thank you for the moderation.